Vassena. I hope I pronounce this correctly, Vassena, potentially.
Yeah, you did almost. Vassena. All right, I will start my presentation. Okay. So, hi everyone. Thanks for having me here. This is really interesting symposium. Today, I would like to tell you a little bit about surprise and value from a perspective of meta-learning. And I'd like to propose that could be the neural mechanisms that underlies adaptive and maladaptive decision-making. So to guide you a little bit through the outline of my talk, first I'll give a brief discussion of what are the key computational signals that we use in modeling learning and decision making, and you heard a little bit about it already. So a short comparison between a surprise-based model and a value-based model. I'd like to propose meta-learning as a possible mechanism as a unifying solution to what we call the cost-benefit dilemma, so in decision making. And then providing a neurobiological implementation of this mechanism and a computational framework to understand both adaptive and maladaptive decisions. But first, to start a little bit on a personal note, I'd like to give you an example of what we mean when we talk about surprise. And for me, at least in this talk, surprise equals a prediction error. And I'm sure we have learned about it today. We'll learn some more tomorrow about potential dissociations, perhaps. But as far as my talk goes, surprise and prediction error, I consider them overlapping concepts. I'd like to illustrate that with a personal example. So imagine you go for a checkup at your doctor, particularly your gynecologist, and he tells you everything is fine with you. Actually, you're pregnant. That's quite a prediction error. Then imagine you go back again after a month or so for another checkup, and then the gynecologist tells you everything is going really well with your baby. And in fact, wait a second, there's another one. You're expecting twins. I can assure you this was a huge prediction error. And these were obviously my ultrasounds. And that was 4 years ago. It was 2016. So now these are my twins. And of course, after such a huge prediction error, that's something that makes you learn and definitely updates your expectations for the future. And it updates the expectation in such a way that now in your next prediction, you'll know that you have a higher probability of expecting twins. But this didn't discourage me because here I am now pregnant again. But unfortunately, it's only one. So I'm not too sick and I'm able to be here with you today. Virtually, maybe in person would not have been possible. All right, so enough for the personal introduction. In conceptual terms, prediction error obviously is a discrepancy between an expected outcome and an actual outcome. It's a key computational quantity in many learning algorithms, and we have heard that today already. Is used, for example, in actor-critic RL models, is used in temporal different learning models, in all sorts of perspectives, and has been linked with neural activity, particularly in medial prefrontal cortex, and the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, as well as other neural areas, for example, VTA, brainstem, but also striatum. So the first model I'd like to tell you about is the predictive response outcome model, known as the PRO model by Alexander and Brown, which indeed relies on this idea that prediction error is essential for learning. And I'll try to walk you through here conceptually the architecture of the model, and I refer you to the paper for the details. But the idea here is that every time we encounter a stimulus, we then encode it at the neural level, and we have a neural representation of this stimulus, and that this leads to an outcome prediction based on our previous experience. Of course, we will get some feedback from the environment, which will also be coded. And then there will be a comparison between the predicted outcome and the actual outcome, generating an error signal. And the critical aspect here is that this error signal will update your predictions for the future. So this could seem like a relatively simple model. It's quite powerful and explains activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, potentially during any surprising event. So for example, when you make errors that are surprising outcomes, because in principle you're expecting to perform correctly at any task you are performing, or when you encounter cues or outcomes that are surprisingly lower or higher in value compared to what you expected, so more value-based prediction error, or when you encounter a situation of conflict, when you have multiple available response options that are equally likely, and as a consequence, any response that you end up selecting is equally surprising. So the idea here is that this brain area with this computational mechanism works a little bit as a monitor, tracking a different series of surprise signals. And what we found in an fMRI study that we ran some time ago was indeed that we could track a series of different types of surprise signals, and you see that represented here. So we would all along the MPFC, some co-varying with a cue-related and response-related surprise. So when the cues would be better or worse than you expected, or when you would have a response that was surprising because multiple responses were equally likely, but also when you would have a surprise at the reward level or a surprise at the feedback level. And interestingly, as you can see, some extent of regional dissociability along the rostrocaudal axis in medial prefrontal cortex. All right, so it seems that this model is good in capturing surprise-related signals from different sources within a task. So I could say, okay, that's it, the end. This explains all types of surprises. Of course, it's not really true. Well, what about value? Is it really all, does it end with surprise? Don't we need value as a computational quantity and as a concept to explain behavior? Well, we know anecdotally, of course, that behavior is driven by the pursuit of rewards. And we heard this mentioned already today. One of the real classical findings from Schultz, that activity in the ventral tegmental area reflects a shift from a reward outcome to a reward predicting stimulus, and that we can see this pattern clearly in dopamine neurons in VTA. And this type of reward prediction error signal is really critical for conditioning, so for learning about rewards. So based on this principle, another model has been developed called the reward value prediction model, the RVPM, by Silvetti and colleagues. And the idea here is that, again, it's the medial prefrontal cortex, or dorsal ACC, that still predicts the likelihood of actions and outcomes, like we've seen in the pro, but only if these are valuable. So if they lead to a reward. So in a way, we could say that the previously described pro model focuses on a sort of more general predictions, so whatever you're predicting and whatever it's unexpected, while this RVPM model focuses on whatever prediction is related to a reward and to value. And the idea here is indeed that these predictions are learned through the dopaminergic input that comes from the brainstem from the VTA. And interestingly, the RVPM also captures neural signatures on a number of effects that are observed in medial prefrontal cortex. For example, error-related activity, reward estimation, conflict, uncertainty, and volatility effects, possibly in interaction with the locus ceruleus. So what this model predicts, of course, is in line with empirical data. This is a gambling task we ran a while ago, where indeed we found this prominent contribution of medial PFC to prediction error. Although in this case, you can see from this plot here, was mainly driven by a positive prediction error and only much more marginally by a negative prediction error, which is more often the case. And the same author of the model in a model-based study, they also they looked specifically at model predictions using model regressors and in a two-arm bandit task, and they found indeed that the model regressors were reflected in medial PFC dorsal ACC activity, and particularly they saw that activity in this area could distinguish as expected between different types of environments that would be stable and uncertain, or volatile. And interestingly, they also find indeed, according to their hypothesis, that basically ACC here tracks overall uncertainty, and the real signature of volatility is more encoded by the locus coeruleus. So, okay, what we come out here with is actually that there is a surprising overlap between two perspectives that seem to be quite different to start with. So we are learning when we have prediction errors about value, or we are learning when we have prediction errors in general. So what is there a difference? What is the difference? Both models do pretty well in explaining a series of effects that we find empirically in the medial prefrontal cortex. So in that sense, they're integrative. So they don't model one single task or one single effect, but they capture a range of effects, really. They're both based on a similar principle of learning Q outcome associations through prediction error. And indeed, they capture similar effects. So this kind of raises one question of whether this difference, is it surprise or its value? Is it real or is it conceptual? Is it an interpretation? And indeed, we know from previous work that neurons in the BTA respond to reward prediction errors, but they also respond to salience, they respond to punishment, they respond to novelty. So the picture is more complex. And of course, we also know that value-based prediction errors or prediction errors of other types are found in other regions, cortical and subcortical, and not only in medial prefrontal cortex. And the same goes for state prediction errors. So basically, this debate is kind of ongoing still. So it is this kind of surprise that is so important for learning and for making decisions. Is it cold or warm? So what is the effect of adding value on top of it? What is the advantage? And what I would like to put out there, and that's perhaps we will have the chance to discuss or even more after tomorrow, is the intriguing possibility that surprise itself is valuable. It has been mentioned already in the Q&A earlier today. And particularly that surprise may have a learned evolutionary value, so that we either ontogenetically or phylogenetically learned that surprise is valuable because it tells us information that in the end maximize our fitness. Which basically goes along with saying that minimizing uncertainty is valuable. And with respect to this, I'd like to briefly point out this other model, which is basically a subsequent development of the PRO model. And this model here, the HER, the hierarchical error representation model by Alexander and Brown, it's kind of implementing a little bit this idea. So it's, in a nutshell, is a hierarchical representation of the PRO, where we have loops, recurring loops between medial and lateral prefrontal cortex. And what happens is that prediction errors of the medial prefrontal cortex are passed upwards to the lateral prefrontal cortex, and their error representations are stored. And these error representations basically link the error signal with a specific stimulus or a specific context in which the error occurred. And this allows future predictions of the amount of prediction error expected in any situation. So basically the way these loops work is ending up towards an error, a minimization of the error prediction. All right, so I would like to, again, leave this up there. Is surprise itself valuable? And I hope we can discuss this more later on. And this brings me to the second part of my talk. So, okay, value and surprise are important, but how do we use the signal? How do they drive adaptive behavior? In particular, how do they drive decision making? So here I would like to tell you how we think meta-learning could be a good solution to the critical decision-making dilemma between trading off costing and cost and benefits. Okay, so what is the cost-benefit dilemma exactly? Well, most of behaviors that lead to a reward actually require some amount of effort. And indeed, both psychology and neuroscience have studied this type of decisions already for quite a while. We have this classical theory already from the 80s describing how humans make decisions about reward and effort. And intuitively, humans put more effort in tasks that are more difficult. You see here, the more difficult the task, the more effort is exerted. Depending on how much positive benefits they can get for it. So the potential motivation that you see here. And obviously this amount of potential motivation, so how much reward of any kind you can get from putting effort in it, influences how much effort you actually exert in the end. So probably given the type of audience, you will know that in behavioral neuroscience, this has also been studied a lot, mainly in rodents with this type of typical paradigm. So the rodent is put at the beginning of a T-maze, and there is one arm where there is a small reward that's easy to get, and another arm where there is a larger reward, but the rat has to climb over a barrier to get it. And the main findings in this line of research have basically been that dopamine is really important for these effort-based decisions, and that particularly when dopamine is depleted or lesioned, then animals become lazy and they cannot climb the barrier to get food anymore. And more recent work, particularly in monkeys, has shown that noradrenaline is also really important for energizing this kind of high effort, large rewards behaviors. Seminal work has also, still in monkeys, has shown the importance of anterior cingulate cortex as well, showing that with the lesion and the ACC, again, animals become lazy and they cannot go for the effortful option anymore. So how has this been studied in humans? Not with mazes, although we could try. But one of the most used paradigms has been for physical effort, this kind of thing, the dynamometer, so kind of joystick that you can squeeze. And basically people are told they need to squeeze up to a certain amount of their total squeezing capacity, their maximum force, to actually obtain the reward. And what we find is that people also behave like rodents, so they generally avoid effort when they can, but they do effort when they can get a reward. And that interestingly, this kind of decisions are tracked by the anterior cingulate cortex. So some of our early work started here, where we got interested in how this motivational aspects were implemented in the brain, not in effort in general, but particularly for mental effort. So that's how we started. And in one of our first experiments, we proposed participants to engage in an easy or a difficult mental task, or to engage in an average mental task for a large or a small reward. And one of the first interesting findings was indeed that we found that preparing for a large reward task as expected would result in increased activity in anterior cingulate medial PFC, as well in the striatum, but also that a similar network was implicated when people were expecting to engage in a harder task. So that's what opens paved the way to the follow-up experiments to try to see whether this network, as had been seen previously in animals, was also involved in trading off decisions about reward and cost, in this particular case, mental efforts. So that's when we implemented this task where we offered participants with decisions, whether they wanted to perform a hard task for a small reward. And after that, we asked them to actually perform this task. As you can see, this was the type of task that they would perform, arithmetic calculations of different degrees of difficulties for different degrees. And so in behavioral terms, participants do what we expect them to do. In terms of decisions, they accept a lot less when the task becomes harder, and particularly so when the reward is low. So that's what we expect. And in terms of performance, the harder the task, the worse they perform. So great, in behavioral terms, they do what we expect, but what about the brain? And here is what we find. So you see in red activity during decision and in green activity during anticipation before they're preparing to do it, both cases during the cues. And particularly the regions that are activated here are regions that increase parametrically with effort. So the higher the effort level that is presented in the decision or in the preparation, the more these regions are active. So basically the conclusion here is, okay, so this network indeed involving the anterior cingulate is definitely involved in trade-off, in decision-making trade-offs about mental effort. And it was particularly interesting to see that a similar region was also more active for the same contrast during the time they were actually performing the calculation. All right, so basically what I told you so far shows that it seems like that this cost-benefit trade-off is worth the effort is determinant in making adaptive decisions, and that it relies on this plausible neural implementation involving medial prefrontal cortex, and as we've seen in human studies and in animal studies, and on catecholamines, dopamine and adrenaline, as we have seen from rodents and monkey studies. But of course, this doesn't answer the question of what is the actual mechanism that is behind this implementation. So that's what brought us to develop this model together with Massimo Silvetti. And the idea here, as I was anticipating before, is that the solution is meta-learning. So here is the reinforcement meta-learning, RML model from now on, which we consider a possible neurobiological implementation of meta-learning. And the key mechanism here is the bidirectional interaction between medial prefrontal cortex, ACC, and the brainstem, where from the one hand, the ACC receives learning signals from the brainstem about value and prediction error and about environmental volatility from DLC, but it's also able to top-down modulate these signals. And to give you a bit of a clearer idea of how the architecture works, basically within the RML, we have two different key components. We have the ACC and PFC part, and then we have the VTA-LC, the catecholaminergic part. And the ACC part selects actions towards the environment, so which actions are the most valuable. And the brainstem part receives information from the environment, so basically feedback signals of what reward you're actually getting and the level of volatility. So as I mentioned already, the critical aspect here is that the interaction here is bidirectional, right? So that this information, these signals can go up to ACC from the brainstem, but in turn, ACC itself can also top-down regulate catecholamine release. So that's where the meta-learning aspect comes in, so that the model not only as parameters that influence the behavior towards the environment, but it's also able to influence the internal parameters as well. And last but not least, it's also able to modulate other brain areas. So, and we will see how that becomes relevant later. But for example, boosting noradrenaline towards task-relevant areas in the case of the effortful behavior. So I need to refer you for the mathematical details to the paper. This is a little bit of a more detailed architecture. And I wanted to show you just to highlight the, again, the fact that the model contains basically this double loop. So the fact that we have the ACC selecting actions toward the environment, as in previous models, but also the ACC, that we call the ACC boost here, able to modulate its own internal parameters to modulate noradrenaline release and dopamine release. Okay, so now we have this this model, this theory that meta learning could be a good model of adaptive decision making. The first question is, can this model simulate existing data? And the first simulations we did here was, again, the one from our friends, the rodents, in the typical case of the T maze-like task. So we give the model a task where there are different small or large reward options. And basically, we see that the model behaves like we expect. So the model engages often in high reward, high effort options. And in this case, it almost never refuses to engage, which is also what animals do. They also engage in high reward, high effort option. However, if we deplete, if we lesion the dopaminergic input, simulating a dopaminergic depletion, this percentage dramatically drops, meaning that the model becomes lazier and doesn't want to engage anymore for high effort, even though it would lead to a high reward. And we also see that the probability of staying raises quite a bit. So in some cases, the model doesn't do anything at all, just considers it not worth it. And that nicely reproduces what animals are also doing. So a second set of important simulations is about adaptive control of learning rates in volatile environments. This is work that was also based on the predecessor of the RML. It was the RVPM, the model I showed in the beginning of the talk. But to give you an idea, what we did here is that we give the model kind of simple to unbounded task, but then we design environments with different levels of certainty and volatility. So we can have environments that are stable, and you see stationary here, 1 and 2, but 1 is very uncertain in terms of probabilities. So the probability that option 1 or 2 is rewarding is very uncertain. And then we have a volatile environment where the probabilities are clear, but they switch a lot. And what we see here, interestingly, is that the model here clearly distinguishes between these 3 environments. So whether it's a stationary, uncertain, or volatile. And still by the same author, this was nicely tracked by pupil size. So reflecting the idea that it would be tracked by the locus ceruleus. Okay. A third set of empirical data that the model can simulate are the differences, known differences between Pavlovian and instrumental conditioning. So we know that it's very difficult to learn higher order associations in Pavlovian conditioning. I'll just show this to make it clearer. But basically, it is very difficult to learn that you would get a reward for a second or third order association in only Pavlovian conditioning. So you are not doing anything, but mostly we don't learn this, okay? And that's also how the model behaves. However, if it's instrumental conditioning, so if we are actually making choices and performing actions, we can learn up to third order conditioning. So meaning that we can learn sequences of actions that lead to a certain reward. And the model can capture this. And the interesting thing is, how does it capture it? Well, it's because in the model, when an action is performed, this boost is necessary. And boost equals increased levels of catecholamines. And this increased level of catecholamines not only is related to the action, but also boosts the learning. So which is why then this VTA learning signal allows this associating then the cue with the reward, which does not happen in Pavlovian conditioning because there are no actions. And what you see here is indeed the confirmation of what I just said from the model, seeing that the boosting signal in ACC is much higher in instrumental because there are actually actions that need to be performed. Okay, so next question is, can RML do our task? So here I showed you how it would simulate previous data, but is it applicable in our decision-making case? That's what we tried. This is what participants would do, I showed you before. And this is also what the model does. If we give the model choices between different options of different degrees of effort and reward, the model tracks behavior quite well. And you see the probability of accepting harder task declines over time. And it's much higher for high rewarders compared to low rewards. Does it predict average activity in ACC? So does it really track neural activity as well besides behavior? So if we take here model activity, taking the ACC module, that's what we get. So we see that for low rewards, we have increasing over effort levels, we have increased activity dropping after a certain point from the model's perspective, because this is not worth engaging anymore. While for high rewards, we have a linear increase. And then we see qualitatively a similar pattern in real DCC. So these are data taken from the experiment that I showed you before, only the average results. So qualitatively, it seems to capture this pattern of linear as compared to an inverted U. And next question is, does it predict individualized AC activity? So in a quantitative fashion in a model-based analysis. So what we did now was taking the actual choices that participants made in the experiment. We fed those choices to the model, and then we asked the model to simulate a neural activity that would lead to these choices. And we feed this to our brain data, and what we nicely find is, again, this MPFC ACC part. So it seems this is a nice model-based validation indeed that our model ACC behaves like the participants ACC. So an important aspect is, are these predictions in line with other theories, like the MIT theory that I showed you in the beginning? And I can quickly show you that that is the case. So here, it's some RML simulations to kind of exemplify the MIT predictions. Here, in a case where a task is hard but feasible, we see that the model progressively engages less and less, and that this is related to the boosting, of course, and that this is nicely modulated by the amount of reward. So when the reward is lower, it's not as worth, so the level of boosting drops earlier, and you see it also here, the engagement. And if we boost up the difficulty instead, if we make the task really hard, as predicted by MIT as well, engaging just drops, obviously, and the same goes for boosting, and even more so when the reward is low. So from here we can conclude these predictions are very much in line with the conceptual predictions made quite a lot earlier by MIT theory. And finally, we have some little bit of time left. Can we produce novel and testable quantitative predictions with this model? So can we use the model as a theory for making new predictions, which is actually the nicest feature. So here we reasoned what we could do to try to simulate abnormal decision-making. We thought of simulating abnormal catecholaminergic control. And particularly so we know that different level of catecholamines may be linked to certain disorders. And here we propose that this may be regulated by serotonin levels on a longer time scale. Indeed, we know there have been several computational theories on serotonin and its potential role in encoding costs. And we also know from some recent empirical work that serotonin promotes effort allocation. So the idea here was, all right, can we use this model to try to see if we can simulate the effects of serotonin depletion through its effects on catecholamines, and obviously the cascade effect on the loops in the meta-learning model. So that's what we did in a couple of tasks. Yeah, I'm looking, how am I doing time-wise, Mikhail? Can I go for a few more minutes?
Not, yeah, how many? You got 1 or 2, but you can maybe, if you want, you can go for 3.
Yeah, okay, great.
Or 4, whatever, then we maybe need to cut a little bit with the question. Just go ahead.
All right. So here what we tried was, again, trying to give the model an effort avoidance task and then simulate serotonin depletion, basically. And that's what we see here when we simulate a serotonin depletion, where the implementation of serotonin means indeed over a longer time scale, increased or decreased overall catecholaminergic boosting. When we lesion it, we see that, again, the model refuses to engage for the high reward, high effort option, and even decides to not engage at all often. And interestingly, we simulated also a completely different task where we didn't vary effort anymore, but now we varied the amount of reward, the probability of reward, sort of simulating different environments. So first a high rewarding environment, then a frustrating environment, and then a high rewarding environment again. And what we find here, it's quite interesting, and that in the beginning, the model works quite well in both the environments. But then when, after being frustrated, the environment becomes good again, only the healthy model recovers properly. And the serotonin depleted model actually remains kind of pessimistic. And we see this in the behavior as well. So we see that in the beginning, we see that in the beginning, when the reward is high, the model engages a lot, so it doesn't stay very much. When the reward becomes low, it stays a lot more, so it becomes a lot more avoidance. And then it recovers well in the control case, but not so well in the serotonergic depletion case. So kind of suggesting this could be a substrate for some known theories of depression, for example, that where depressed patients have a hard time recovering from frustrating situations. So not as much general reward sensitivity deficits, but more learning deficits over time. So basically, we can conclude, yes, we can make some nice and testable novel predictions, which we are working on testing at the moment. So just to wrap up, I hope I've showed you that RML could be a good model of meta-learning and catecholaminergic regulations and can capture key effects in adaptive behavior from reward prediction to decision-making. And we validated it through model-based fMRI, and it's conceptually in line with other theories. It could be potentially used as a computational phenotyping tool because it gives us this opportunity of measuring but also simulating catecholamines and serotonin levels. And finally, I would like to highlight the importance of using neurobiologically plausible models as tools for further theory developments. And here I would like to raise this one last idea, going back to what I raised in the first part as well, on whether actually this could potentially be a substrate for intrinsic motivation. Because what I showed you before here, it's basically that the ACC medial PFC can influence top-down catecholamine release. This can also mean that it can influence dopamine release, right? So it means that dopaminergic boosts not only come from the environment, not only from rewards, but could also be internally driven. Like in our case of the higher order conditioning, when you have to proceed to a sequences of action when the reward is not immediate, but then the reason why you manage to proceed to a sequences of action is this intermediate dopaminergic boost that keep you going. So the idea here could be that intrinsic motivation and even curiosity, if you will, or a minimization of uncertainty could be behaviors that are very high level that we have overlearned and through which potentially overlearn in terms of memory or prefrontal representations that are able then to top-down modulate our behavior via this top-down dopaminergic boost system. And I would like to thank my collaborators on most of these studies. And in the meantime, I'd like to leave this slide up about diversity in science, which we find very important. So please take a minute just to consider having a look. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions, and maybe I'd like to say something. If speakers would like to ask a question, I think you cannot post your question in the question and answer session, but you're the few ones who can actually unmute themselves. So please make use of it and just unmute yourself and ask the question. If there are none, maybe I start, and I will ask a question by an anonymous attendee asking, prediction error could trigger curiosity and exploration if one feels that one has the capability to resolve the uncertainty, or it could trigger anxiety and behavioral inhibition if one believes that one has no ability to cope with the prediction error. So the question is, how can we distinguish the different outcomes of prediction error?
Yeah, that's a really interesting dissociation that immediately makes me think of controllability, which I personally find computation a very interesting concept. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it could trigger an adaptive behavior to minimize the uncertainty when it's possible, and it could just trigger frustration when it's not possible. How can we distinguish that? Yeah, I would say that my idea would be exactly controllability, and that the extent to which an outcome is controllable could also be an emergent computation, could be an emergent quantity, possibly depending on serotonin levels, but it's complete speculation. And that this would be the controllability level would be what then has consequences in terms of, yeah, here we say anxiety, but that could be the determinant of whether actually we engage or disengage.
Okay. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So for the next question, we have from Malian. Sorry if I butchered that name, but the question is it possible to distinguish between value and surprise-related activity in the MPFC DACC, i.e. using fMRI or potentially other tools?
Yeah, that's actually also an excellent question and tricky. I think I've kind of shown it. It's not really easy to dissociate that. And it's also not always easy to find overall surprise activity. So in my study I showed you earlier, that's what we're going to look for, unsigned prediction error. But there we clearly saw that the positive prediction error was much stronger. So it's very mixed as far as I know in the literature. And there I can also say that to some extent I've kind of developed the intuition that it also may be a little bit of a salience issue. So of what really affects this prediction error activity in ACC also depends on how much we care about the reward and not as much as what we define the absolute value that we give to it. And that's why we have this variety of findings where it's not always easy to detect the unsigned. But yeah, as far as I can tell, at least at the fMRI level, it's tricky to dissociate those. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Jacqueline, do you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Eliana. Very nice talk. So I was just wondering, when you introduced serotonin in your model, can you be a little more specific? What was it doing? How does it interact with these other norepinephrine and dopamine? I guess they already, having thought about this model a little bit, I know that just teasing apart norepinephrine and dopamine is a headache in and of itself because they interact with each other. And as you know, they have very overlapping effects in the brain. They co-activate each other's receptors and so on. So I was wondering, how do you work in serotonin? What does it do there?
Yeah, so about noradrenaline and dopamine, we are working on that, on dissociation. We are doing some simulation work on some basic cognitive tasks that have manipulations, pharmacological manipulation of both. So to some extent, we can find some differences, but it's too preliminary for me to share them at the moment. But yeah, so the idea is that serotonin would work on a much longer time scale, based on the evidence that SSRIs take up to 3 weeks to actually give behavioral differences. And the idea is that they work as a metaparameter on top of the release. So the release of noradrenaline and dopamine is kind of phasic and depending on the specific task trial context. And that serotonin on top slowly boosts the release of catecholamines. So makes the system a little bit more generous in releasing dopamine and noradrenaline over time. But this takes time, a learning time for the model to actually have a substantial behavioral effect. And this would be the reason why indeed we see these effects not immediately, but why they take time to occur. So it's like a slow modulatory boosting effect. Yeah.
That's interesting. Could I have a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you think about it more as a mood variable, right? So hopefulness would be. But I wonder another way in which animals determine learnability, and the key thing is whether you think a context is controllable or learnable by you right now. But there's also a cognitive dimension to determining that, right? So often, it's a very difficult computational problem when you're faced with some uncertainty or randomness to decide whether that's learnable or unlearnable. Okay, that's very hard to do, right? And we are, I ask because we're just doing an experiment now in which it seems that monkeys, when you present them with totally random sequences, they infer an order. They infer a set of stimuli that they infer that A is better than B and B is better than C and C is better than D, and they consistently act on that order. So I wonder if there's if you ever thought about, obviously all of this is a model-based thing, so you have to understand how people exert cognitive effort in relation to what their internal model of the environment is. I wonder if you ever thought about that.
Yeah, I find that really intriguing. And we have been talking about this for quite a long time. I haven't had the chance to do too much modeling work in the direction, but definitely the idea that the serotonin has something to do with this persistence is kind of there. And that it's what determines this kind of thrust and the inverted view of whether you disengage or not, and to what extent how wide your tolerability is for failures, basically. So if you keep on failing, how much do you still remain in that range by which you keep on trying anyway, so you're not giving up? And I think that, having a nice formal way of measuring this range and this persistence, the stickiness, if you will, it would be really interesting to look at to what extent it's adaptive in which context, and when it becomes then pathological. Because in the depression simulations, another idea was that indeed kind of mood and hopefulness, but also sensitivity to the environment anyway, because some of these old theories about depression have to do with the fact that the patients become insensitive to the environment, and that's why they don't recover as well. And that's why they remain in a depression loop, because they are not sensitive to the positive outcomes anymore. So the idea that serotonin potentially could modulate how sensitive you actually are to the reward outcomes trial by trial, I think that would be also really interesting to look at. And this persistence, that's really intriguing, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's time for the break right now. If you hadn't had a chance to ask your question, we have a final round of questions and discussion at the very end of the next session. So let's have a 17-minute break, and let us back at 17:40 with Wolfram's talk.